Your RSUs are coming up next. So now you're probably trying to work out three things: how much tax will come out, what you will actually receive, and whether you should sell the shares or keep them. The tax part can be worked out, but the sell or hold decision often still feels strangely difficult. Here's what I mean. Two people receive £50,000 this month. One receives it as cash, one receives it as company shares. The cash recipient asks, what should this money do? The share recipient asks, should I sell this? Same value, completely different instinct. This video is about why that happens and a simple rule that can make RSU decision clearer. If you're newer to RSUs, they're shares your employer gives you as part of your total compensation. Typically, you do not receive them all immediately. They become yours over time through a process called vesting. And once RSUs vest, the simplest way to understand them is this: they are employment income paid in shares. HMRC treats the market value of the shares on vesting day as income, so income tax applies. Employee national insurance usually applies as well. And there's one actual UK-specific detail worth checking: employer national insurance. In some schemes, your employer covers their own NI costs. In others, that cost is passed on to you under the share plan rules, so check your scheme documents or payslip. In many schemes, this is handled through something called sell to cover. That just means some of the shares will be sold automatically to cover the tax and national insurances before anything lands in your account. So if you were granted 15,000 shares, you may not actually see 15,000 shares arrive. You see the net amount after tax. But the basic idea is not that different from receiving cash compensation. The tax is being dealt with first, then what remains belongs to you. The difference is that instead of landing in your bank account as cash, the net value usually lands in a brokerage account as shares. And from that point, those shares are an investment. If you later sell them after the price has moved, any gain after vesting may fall into capital gain tax territory. So there can be two stages: tax at vesting, because it is employment income, and potentially capital gain tax later, because the remaining shares are now an investment. The jargon makes this feel more complicated than it is. And perhaps because of that, most people treat this as a tax problem. Work out the tax and the decision will follow. But once I had worked that out, the real questions were still there. Should I sell? Should I hold? If I sell, when? Understanding the tax hadn't made the decision any clearer. The tax was never actually what was blocking me. And looking back, I think there are three reasons that made the decision feel much heavier than a normal cash decision. The first reason was that I thought I had an edge. I was working at a large UK-listed company. I knew the customers, I knew the strategy, I knew how the business was performing commercially. And there is that Peter Lynch idea: invest in what you know. In my role, it really did feel like I knew something useful. It felt like I had an edge an average retail investor would not have. So I held, but the shares did not move the way my business knowledge suggested they would. That was the first time I really understood the difference. Knowing the business better than most people is not the same as knowing what the share price will do. Because share prices respond to things that sit far outside day-to-day business knowledge. Macro conditions, sector sentiment, analyst positioning, market expectations. Things that are outside your visibility, even if you're close to the business. The edge was narrow than it felt. The second reason is that the shares did not feel like ordinary money. This is not just about the RSUs. It is how we treat things once we own them. Selling starts to feel like giving something up, even if we would never have chosen to buy the same thing with cash. That is called the endowment effect. And employer shares carry something extra on top of that. They did not arrive randomly. They came from staying, from performance, from years of work. So selling can feel like undoing something you earned. Cash rarely carries the same weight. And the third reason is regret. I feel this myself. 1 year I sold at vesting. The price went up afterwards. I feel stupid. Another year I held. The price went down when the wider market did well. I feel stupid again. That is the trap. If you sell and the price rises, you regret selling. If you hold and the price falls, you regret holding. But neither outcome was fully in your control, and neither outcome was a verdict on whether the decision was sensible. So this is why RSUs can feel so different from cash. They feel connected to what you know. They feel connected to what you earned. And they feel connected to whether you will look clever or foolish afterwards. That is why a 50,000 cash decision can feel simple, while a 50,000 RSU decision can feel loaded. And once you see that, the solution can become much simpler. But before we get there, there's one real risk we need to separate from all these psychological risks. Think about everything that currently depends on your employer: your salary, your bonus, your unvested RSUs, the share you're still waiting to receive, your career progression, your professional reputation in your industry. All of that is already tied to one company. Then, if you keep the vested shares as well, your invested capital also joins the same stack. That is not just a single stock risk, it is a structured dependency. A bad earnings report, a strategic pivot, or a sector downturn may not only affect the share price. The bonus pool may be reduced, promotion may be slowed down. Hiring may freeze. A restructure or redundancy could happen at the exact moment your unvested shares are worthless. Now, some people watching this will be thinking, but my company is a long-term growth company. The people who held will be rewarded. And that may be true. There are companies, Nvidia, Palantir, the Magnificent Seven type names, that many investors would be happy to own. Some are large parts of major indices for a reason. The argument is not that the share price will go down or that the company is bad. It is about how much of your financial life is exposed to one company's outcome. Because even with a great company, you do not control the timing. You do not control whether a bad year happens before or after your next vesting day. You do not control whether a sector downturn overlaps with your bonus season. You do not control whether a hiring freeze, restructure, or share price fall arrives at the same time you need flexibility. That is where proportion matters. If the shares are a small part of your overall wealth and your security does not depend on them, then the decision looks different. But if they are a meaningful part of your net worth, you're not just holding a stock. You're keeping more of your income, your future income, and invested capital tied to the same company. Doing nothing feels neutral, but if the shares stay there, the decision has already been made by default. So how do you actually decide? The simplest way is to treat RSUs as cash lump sum, because in a very practical sense, that is already what has happened. When RSUs vest, they are usually treated as employment income. You pay income tax and national insurance on the value. After that, whatever shares remain are no longer just a future compensation, they are an investment. And if you leave them where they are, the vesting process has quietly made a few decisions for you. The money stays in a taxable investment account. It stays on a company's chosen platform. It stays invested in your company's shares. And the most important question gets skipped. What should this money actually do for you? That is the separation rule. The shares arrived through your employment, but the amount you continue to hold should be decided as an investor. So ask yourself this: if the same net amount landed in your bank account today, not as shares, just as cash, how much of it would you deliberately use to buy shares in your employer? Not in tech broadly, not in an index, in your specific employer. The same company that pays your salary, your bonus, and holds your unvested equity. Most people asked that way would not invest all of it there. Many would not invest any of it. And once you ask the question this way, the decision changes shape. You're no longer asking, should I sell shares in a company I know well? You're asking, what should this capital do? Some of it might belong to your pension if long-term security is the priority. Some might belong in cash if your buffer is thin. Some might belong in an ISA or accessible investment if flexibility matters. Some might still stay in your employer's shares if that is a deliberate proportion you're comfortable with. The point is not that everyone should sell their shares immediately. The point is that allocation should be chosen, not inherited by default. This is what I finally took away. Selling vested RSUs is not a verdict on the company. It is not a bet against your employer. It is simply moving the money back to your own financial design. And if you want simple frameworks to think through how to deal with lump sums across time horizons, tax wrappers, and portfolio fit, I have a whole series on capital allocation that I will link below. So that is the decision frame. First, understand what happens at vesting. Then separate how the shares arrived from what you choose to hold. And finally, treat the net value like capital that needs a job. That is where the next question begins. If this money is no longer automatically company shares, where should it actually go? That depends on your wider system, your cash buffer, your pension, your ISA, your accessible investments, your time horizon, and how much flexibility you want to preserve. I've linked the most useful next video below. It is specifically about that allocation decision when meaningful capital is available, but the order of priorities is not obvious. And if you're making a life decision and want a more structured look at your own position, I've linked the current ways to work with me in the description. Thank you for watching. I will see you in my next video.